What I'm about to tell you defies human comprehension and challenges everything you thought you knew about the limits of imperial cruelty. In the private quarters of one Roman emperor's palace, a carefully maintained journal documented something so disturbing that historians have struggled for centuries to fully convey its horror. Emperor Commodus didn't just feed prisoners to wild animals for sport. He meticulously recorded each feeding session, rating the performance of both beasts and victims like a twisted entertainment critic. He would personally watch from his golden throne as condemned souls were torn apart by lions, bears, and exotic creatures, often placing bets with his courtiers on how long each victim would survive. These weren't public executions in the Colosseum that history remembers. These were private, intimate displays of sadism conducted in his personal arena, where the most powerful man on earth transformed human suffering into his personal amusement. The detailed records he kept of these sessions reveal a level of calculated cruelty that was covered up for centuries. But before we descend into the unthinkable depths of Commodus's depravity, we need to understand how the son of Rome's greatest philosopher-emperor became history's most twisted monster. The year was 180 AD, and the Roman Empire stood at the absolute pinnacle of human civilization. Under the wise rule of Marcus Aurelius, the great philosopher-emperor, Rome had experienced unprecedented peace and prosperity. The Pax Romana had brought stability to the known world, stretching from the misty forests of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt. Marcus Aurelius, author of the timeless Meditations, embodied the Stoic ideal of the reluctant ruler, a man who would rather contemplate philosophy than wield absolute power over millions. His reign represented the golden zenith of what historians call the Five Good Emperors, a period of enlightened leadership that had blessed Rome for nearly a century. But even the greatest emperors are mortal, and as Marcus Aurelius lay dying on the Germanic frontier, he made a decision that would haunt history. Unlike his predecessors who had carefully chosen worthy successors, Marcus passed the purple to his biological son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, a young man of 19 who had already shown disturbing signs of instability. The Roman Senate watched with growing unease as this pampered prince ascended to absolute power. Unlike his philosophical father, Commodus had spent his youth obsessed with gladiatorial combat, wild animal hunts, and the bloody spectacles of the arena. Where Marcus Aurelius had reluctantly wielded power as a burden, his son embraced it as an opportunity for unlimited self-indulgence. What the world didn't yet realize was that they were witnessing the end of Rome's golden age and the beginning of something far more sinister. The empire that had conquered the known world was about to be ruled by a man who would transform the sacred office of emperor into a platform for the most depraved entertainment in human history. Within months of taking power, whispers began emanating from the imperial palace. Stories so shocking that even hardened Roman nobles struggled to believe them. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most unthinkable rumors are merely the tip of an iceberg of horror. The first signs of Commodus's twisted nature appeared long before he inherited the throne, hidden within the protected walls of the imperial palace, where his true character could develop unchecked. Contemporary historian Cassius Dio, who served as a senator under Commodus and witnessed these events firsthand, recorded incidents that would chill the blood of any rational person. When Commodus was merely 12 years old, an incident occurred at Centum Celli that should have served as a warning to everyone around him. After discovering that his bath had been drawn too cool for his liking, the young prince ordered the bathkeeper to be cast alive into the furnace. Only the quick thinking of a slave who secretly burned a sheep's skin to create the stench of burning flesh, saved the innocent man's life, while allowing the child to believe his murderous command had been carried out. This wasn't the typical tantrum of a spoiled child. It was the calculated cruelty of a developing psychopath who viewed human life as disposable entertainment. As Commodus matured, his obsessions became increasingly disturbing. While other young Roman nobles studied rhetoric, philosophy, and statecraft, he spent his days practicing with gladiatorial weapons and studying the techniques of professional beast hunters. His father, desperately hoping to civilize his son, appointed the finest teachers in the empire: Onesicrates for Greek literature, Antistius Capella for Latin, and Ateus Sanctus for rhetoric. But as the Historia Augusta grimly notes, teachers in all these studies profited him not in the least. The young prince had already chosen his path, and it led not toward wisdom, but toward the arena. Marcus Aurelius, growing increasingly concerned about his son's character, attempted to surround him with the finest moral influences available. He assigned the most virtuous senators as guardians and advisors, hoping their example might reshape his heir's twisted inclinations. Yet Commodus systematically rejected every honorable influence, instead gravitating toward the palace's most corrupt elements. The young prince began maintaining what the historical sources describe as eating houses and low resorts within the imperial palace itself, essentially turning parts of his father's residence into brothels and gambling dens. He herded together women of unusual beauty, keeping them like purchased prostitutes in a sort of brothel for the violation of their chastity. Even more disturbing were the companions he chose. While his father engaged with philosophers and statesmen, Commodus surrounded himself with gladiators, charioteers, and what the sources euphemistically call the most evil of palace servants. These men became his true teachers, instructing him not in virtue but in vice, not in leadership but in brutality. By the time Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, Commodus had already demonstrated a complete disregard for human life and dignity. The empire's new ruler had spent his formative years learning to view other people not as fellow human beings, but as objects for his amusement. A worldview that would soon manifest in ways that defied imagination. What happened after his coronation would prove that the warning signs of his childhood were not aberrations to be outgrown, but previews of horrors yet to come. The young man who had once ordered a servant burned alive for drawing a cool bath was about to gain the power to indulge his darkest impulses on an imperial scale. Within months of becoming emperor, Commodus began transforming the very nature of Roman imperial power from a sacred duty into a platform for sadistic entertainment. But his most disturbing innovation wasn't the public spectacles that shocked the citizens of Rome. It was what he created in the hidden chambers of his private domain. Deep within the imperial palace complex, Commodus constructed a personal arena where he could indulge his most twisted fantasies away from public scrutiny. This wasn't the Grand Colosseum where thousands could witness the spectacle. This was an intimate theater of cruelty, designed for an audience of one, the emperor himself. Historical records, painstakingly preserved by court officials who witnessed these atrocities, reveal the methodical nature of Commodus's private entertainments. He maintained detailed journals documenting each performance, rating both the ferocity of his exotic animals and the suffering of their human victims. These weren't spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were carefully planned exhibitions that the emperor approached with the dedication of a connoisseur. The victims fed to his private menagerie came from various sources: political prisoners who had fallen from favor, captured barbarians from the frontier wars, criminals condemned by the courts, and sometimes simply individuals who had somehow displeased the emperor. Cassius Dio records that Commodus would often condemn men to death for the most trivial offenses, reading a book about Caligula on the wrong day, being too tall or too handsome, or simply being present when the emperor was in a particularly foul mood. But what made these private sessions truly horrifying was the emperor's personal involvement. Unlike traditional executions carried out by subordinates, Commodus personally presided over each feeding, watching intently from his elevated throne as his collection of lions, bears, tigers, elephants, and other exotic beasts tore apart their human prey. The contemporary accounts describe how he would place bets with his courtiers on various aspects of each victim's demise: how long they would survive, which animal would strike first, whether they would attempt to run or fight. The emperor treated human death as a sporting event, complete with odds and wagering. Commodus maintained several lions specifically for these private exhibitions, animals he had trained to recognize the signal for feeding time. Court officials recorded that he knew each beast by name and would often select specific animals based on their particular hunting styles, some for their speed in killing, others for their tendency to play with their prey before delivering the fatal blow. The logistics of these private spectacles required an extensive support system. Servants were tasked with procuring and maintaining the animals, preparing the arena space, and disposing of the remains afterward. The emperor employed professional beast handlers who had previously worked in the public amphitheaters, men who understood how to manipulate animals for maximum entertainment value. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the emperor's practice of inviting select courtiers to witness these private exhibitions. Attendance wasn't optional. When Commodus summoned senators or palace officials to join him for a private viewing, refusal meant death. These unwilling witnesses were forced to watch, cheer, and even participate in the betting, all while maintaining expressions of enthusiasm for fear of joining the victims in the arena. The historical record shows that some of these private sessions lasted for hours, with multiple victims fed to different animals in sequence. Commodus would often combine the human sacrifices with displays of his own hunting prowess, shooting arrows at tethered animals or demonstrating his skills with various gladiatorial weapons. What the emperor didn't realize was that several of his courtiers were secretly documenting these atrocities, creating a historical record that would survive long after his death. These hidden chronicles reveal a level of systematic cruelty that goes beyond mere sadism. They describe a ruler who had completely abandoned any connection to human empathy or moral restraint. But even these private horrors were merely preparation for the public displays that would shock the entire Roman world and cement Commodus's reputation as history's most depraved ruler. By 192 AD, Commodus's private sadistic exhibitions had evolved into something that defied all precedent in Roman history. What began as secret cruelties in hidden palace chambers had transformed into public spectacles that traumatized an entire empire and left witnesses struggling to comprehend what they had seen. The emperor's most infamous public performance occurred during the Plebeian Games in November 1920, an event that Cassius Dio witnessed firsthand and recorded in horrifying detail. On the first day alone, Commodus personally slaughtered 100 bears with arrows and javelins, all while the entire Roman Senate was forced to watch from their designated seats. But this wasn't simply a display of hunting prowess. It was a calculated demonstration of absolute power over life and death. The amphitheater had been specially modified with intersecting walls and elevated galleries, creating 4 separate enclosures where the bears were tracked like fish in a barrel. From his position on the gallery, Commodus could rain down death from above, while remaining completely safe himself. The psychological impact on the witnesses was devastating. Cassius Dio describes how senators sat in stunned silence as their emperor, the supposed guardian of Roman civilization, methodically executed animal after animal, with the cold efficiency of a professional executioner. When Commodus paused mid-slaughter to drink wine from a cup shaped like a club, the assembled crowd was forced to shout the traditional drinking salute. "Long life to you." The historian's account reveals the sheer terror that gripped Rome's elite during these performances. Senator Claudius Pompeianus, stepfather of Commodus and one of Marcus Aurelius's most trusted advisors, refused to attend these spectacles, preferring to risk execution rather than witness the emperor's degradation. He would send his sons in his place while remaining in self-imposed exile, understanding that death was preferable to watching Marcus Aurelius's son descend into such depths of depravity. But the bear slaughter was merely the opening act. Over subsequent days, Commodus descended into the arena itself to engage in what he called gladiatorial combat, though these were hardly fair fights. His opponents were always carefully selected: wounded gladiators, men armed only with wooden weapons, or athletes who had been specifically instructed not to harm the emperor. The most chilling aspect of these performances was Commodus's evident enjoyment of the terror he inspired. Contemporary accounts describe how he would approach the senatorial seating area after killing an ostrich, holding the severed head in one hand and his bloody sword in the other. Without speaking a word, he would grin and nod at the assembled senators, making it clear that they could suffer the same fate at any moment. Cassius Dio's personal account of this moment reveals the psychological torture inflicted on Rome's leadership. Many would indeed have perished by the sword on the spot, for laughing at him, for it was laughter rather than indignation that overcame us. If I had not chewed some laurel leaves, which I got from my garland, myself, and persuaded the others who were sitting near me to do the same, so that in the steady movement of our jaws we might conceal the fact that we were laughing. The emperor's performances weren't limited to animal slaughter. Historical records document that he personally killed tigers, hippopotamuses, elephants, rhinoceroses, and even a giraffe, all while forcing the highest officials of the Roman Empire to watch and cheer. He took particular pride in his left-handed fighting style and kept meticulous records of his, quote, victories, eventually claiming to have defeated over 1,000 opponents in gladiatorial combat. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the emperor's interactions with disabled individuals. In one recorded incident, he gathered all the men in Rome who had lost their feet to disease or accident, fitted them with fake serpent tails around their knees, armed them with sponges instead of stones, and then beat them to death with a club while pretending they were giants from Greek mythology. The emperor's delusions of grandeur reached their peak when he began identifying himself with Hercules, going so far as to have the head of the Colossus of Nero replaced with his own likeness, complete with a club and a bronze lion at its feet. The inscription he ordered carved on this monument read, "Champion of Secretores, only left-handed fighter to conquer 12 times 1,000 men." These weren't the actions of a ruler who had simply lost touch with reality. They were the calculated cruelties of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and reveled in the fear and horror he inspired. Court records show that Commodus was perfectly aware of the effect his actions had on witnesses. He simply didn't care about anything beyond his own twisted entertainment. The systematic nature of his cruelty extended beyond public spectacles to private tortures that defied human comprehension. He would force senators to perform humiliating acts while he watched, order disabled people to be mutilated for his amusement, and create elaborate scenarios where victims were tortured in ways specifically designed to maximize their psychological suffering before death. What makes these accounts even more horrifying is their documentation by multiple independent sources. This wasn't propaganda from political enemies or exaggerated tales from distant provinces. These were eyewitness accounts from senators, court officials, and other members of the imperial administration who were present during these events. The emperor's reign of terror was methodically destroying the very foundations of Roman civilization, transforming the sacred office that had been held by Marcus Aurelius into a platform for unprecedented cruelty. But even Commodus's seemingly unlimited power couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions forever. By late 192 AD, the horror of Commodus's reign had reached a breaking point that even his closest allies could no longer endure. The emperor's escalating demands for public degradation, combined with his increasingly specific threats against individual senators and court officials, finally drove his inner circle to desperate action. The conspiracy that ended Commodus's life wasn't born from political ambition or ideological opposition. It was a desperate act of self-preservation by people who knew they would soon join the victims in his private arena. Aemilius Latus, the Praetorian prefect who had stood beside Commodus during his gladiatorial performances, finally understood that loyalty to this emperor meant inevitable death. The plot involved three key figures: Latus himself, Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain, and Marcia, Commodus's own concubine. These weren't distant enemies, but the people closest to the emperor, individuals who had witnessed his cruelties firsthand and understood that their survival required his death. The assassination itself occurred on December 31st, 1920 AD, as Rome prepared to celebrate the new year. The conspirators had learned that Commodus planned to begin 193 AD by appearing in the Colosseum dressed as a gladiator, formally abandoning any pretense of imperial dignity. More immediately threatening, he had decided to execute both consuls and emerge from the gladiators' quarters on New Year's Day wearing full gladiatorial gear. The historical accounts of his death read like a scene from the very spectacles he had orchestrated. When the initial attempt at poisoning failed due to Commodus's habit of vomiting after excessive drinking, the conspirators sent Narcissus, a professional athlete, to strangle the emperor while he bathed. The symbolism was unmistakable. The man who had spent his reign turning human death into entertainment died at the hands of an athlete, killed in the same manner he might have ordered for one of his arena victims. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's death revealed the extent to which his reign had traumatized the Roman government. The Senate's reaction wasn't celebration but stunned relief, as if they couldn't quite believe that their 12-year nightmare had finally ended. Within hours of the assassination, senators began systematically destroying statues, inscriptions, and other monuments to the dead emperor, in an effort to erase his memory from history. The process of damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of Commodus's memory, was more thorough than any previous example in Roman history. His name was chiseled off monuments, his statues were melted down, and official records were altered to remove references to his reign wherever possible. The months he had renamed after himself were immediately restored to their traditional names, and the city of Rome, which he had briefly renamed Commodiana, was never again referred to by that title. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Commodus's legacy was how his reign permanently altered Roman perceptions of imperial power. Never again would Romans view the emperor as a semi-divine figure deserving of unquestioned reverence.
The memory of what absolute power had produced in Commodus created a lasting wariness about imperial authority that would influence Roman politics for centuries. The detailed historical records that survived his reign, particularly the eyewitness accounts of Cassius Dio and the court documents preserved by terrified bureaucrats, provide modern historians with an unprecedented window into the psychology of absolute corruption. These sources reveal how systematically a human being can abandon moral constraints when granted unlimited power over others. What makes Commodus's story particularly relevant to modern audiences is how clearly the historical record documents the progression from private vice to public atrocity. The young prince who ordered a servant burned for drawing a cool bath became the emperor who fed political prisoners to lions for entertainment.
The escalation wasn't sudden or inexplicable. It was a logical progression that his contemporaries should have recognized and stopped. The failure of Roman institutions to constrain Commodus reveals the fragility of civilizational safeguards when confronted with absolute power wielded by someone completely without moral restraint. The senators who witnessed his atrocities, the court officials who documented his cruelties, and the citizens who were forced to cheer his performances all became complicit in a system that transformed human suffering into imperial entertainment. Modern scholars studying authoritarianism often point to Commodus's reign as a perfect case study in how quickly civilized society can descend into systematic brutality when power is concentrated in the hands of someone incapable of empathy. The detailed historical record provides clear documentation of warning signs that were ignored, institutional failures that enabled escalating cruelty, and the psychological mechanisms by which ordinary people become complicit in atrocities. The ultimate lesson of Commodus's reign isn't simply that power corrupts. It's that societies must remain vigilant against the gradual erosion of moral constraints on authority, because the distance between a cool bath and a lion's den may be shorter than we dare to imagine. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's darkest chapters, the question that haunts every rational observer is how such systematic evil could flourish at the very heart of the world's greatest civilization. The story of Commodus isn't simply an account of one man's depravity. It's a mirror reflecting the capacity for brutality that exists within human nature when all constraints are removed. What makes this historical account so disturbing isn't just the catalog of cruelties we've documented, but the realization that every single detail comes from verified historical sources. These weren't legends or propaganda. They were the documented experiences of senators, court officials, and citizens who witnessed these events firsthand and felt compelled to preserve the truth for future generations. The parallels to our modern world are impossible to ignore. Today, as in ancient Rome, we see how quickly civilized discourse can descend into dehumanization, how easily institutional safeguards can be circumvented by those in power, and how readily ordinary people can become complicit in systems that treat human suffering as entertainment. Commodus's transformation from philosopher-emperor's son to history's most twisted ruler didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that should have been stopped at multiple points along the way. The warning signs we've explored today weren't subtle hints, but blazing red flags that his contemporaries chose to ignore until it was too late. The senators who witnessed his arena performances, the court officials who documented his private cruelties, and the citizens who were forced to cheer his spectacles all faced the same moral choice that confronts us today. Do we speak out against the normalization of cruelty, or do we become complicit through our silence? Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire story is how systematically Commodus documented his own atrocities. His detailed journals rating the performance of both beasts and victims reveal a mind that had completely abandoned any connection to human empathy, yet remained perfectly functional in terms of planning, execution, and record-keeping. This historical nightmare serves as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilizational values when confronted with absolute power, wielded by someone incapable of moral restraint.
The Roman Empire, with all its military might, cultural achievements, and institutional sophistication, proved helpless to constrain a single individual who combined unlimited authority with complete moral vacuum. But there's also hope in this story, the hope that comes from remembering that even Commodus's reign eventually ended, brought down by people who finally found the courage to act when the alternative became unthinkable. The conspiracy that ended his life wasn't led by distant enemies, but by his closest associates, people who had initially enabled his cruelties, but ultimately chose resistance over complicity. The detailed historical record we've explored today exists because brave individuals risked their lives to document the truth, understanding that future generations needed to know exactly what had happened in those palace chambers and arena performances. Their courage in preserving these accounts gives us the knowledge we need to recognize similar warning signs in our own time. As we conclude this exploration of history's darkest imperial reign, remember that the distance between civilization and barbarism is always shorter than we imagine. The lesson of Commodus isn't that such evil is inevitable. It's that eternal vigilance is the price of preventing it. If this journey into Rome's most disturbing imperial reign has opened your eyes to the importance of understanding history's darkest chapters, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Knowledge of the past isn't just academic curiosity. It's our best defense against allowing such horrors to repeat themselves. What aspect of Commodus's reign shocked you the most? Was it his private animal feedings, his public arena performances, or the systematic way he documented his own cruelties? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Understanding how these historical atrocities affect us emotionally is part of building our defenses against their return. Next week, we'll be exploring another chapter in history's catalog of concealed horrors, the secret experiments conducted by medieval plague doctors that were hidden from the public for over 600 years. The techniques they developed in pursuit of understanding the Black Death crossed every conceivable moral boundary, and the detailed records they left behind reveal practices that make even Commodus's arena look merciful by comparison. Until then, remember, history's greatest horrors were enabled by ordinary people who chose silence over truth. Don't let that be your legacy.